In 1506 in the east, Lakandu, the Greek conquerors of Mecca, began to experience internal conflict which led it to the brink of collapse. The people were rioting, component ethnic groups were seceding, and the monarch had only barely escaped several assassination attempts. The reason for this, however, was simply the appearance of a new technology, which had traveled along the Silk Road from distant China. This was gunpowder, as well as the implements for cannons, which were invented by the Matarids when they got a hold of gunpowder in order to fight the Timurids. Lakandu had long been able to suppress its stubborn Muslim minority, but after a fallow harvest, a particular sect of Sunni Muslim rebels calling themselves al-Mustaradat were contacted by the Timurids and given several cannons and advice on how to make more, as well as other weapons. This tore the fabric of Lakandu to shreds, and for a while it seemed that al-Mustaradat would get their caliphate. This was until the crown of Lakandu got their hands on gunpowder, and soon minimized the idea of cannons into a crude, shouldered weapon, the arquebus. At this, contact was made in Visegrad and Poland, and soon everywhere else in Europe, where these weapons were further specialized and mass-produced. The majority of European crowns then shifted their focus from colonial ambition to funding vast gunpowder armies. Meanwhile, in 1509, the Pope granted Vannonia the right to claim an expanse of South America as its very own, and so formed the greater colonial holding of Vannin, Brazil, which was soon thereafter administered exclusively by the Grand Atlantic Charter. In 1512, the Pope canonized Alistair I Monad for his piety and conversion efforts, leading to a greater reverence for the ancient bloodline of the Emperor, and, unintentionally, a greater contempt for Alistair XI. Indeed, his brothers and sisters still lived, Asmund Monad being the most powerful of his siblings, ingratiating himself with the armies of the Empire and helping to bankroll their gunpowder innovations. This put him at odds with the High Lords, as they wanted to keep the armies of the Old World as weak as possible for their own benefit. It was such that three factions with separate and distinct interests began to be clearly defined, that of the Crown supporting Alistair XI, the Blood supporting Asmund, and the Robe supporting the High Lords. At the moment, these factions were not coming to blows, but it would not take a great stretch of the imagination to envision such a thing. Meanwhile, in 1515, the Orthodox Magyarország declared war upon Catholic France, citing cleansing of heresy as their casus belli, though it was more likely that they were simply armed with new weapons and wished to test them by thrashing upon a struggling state. In 1517, Occitania, which had lost its African holdings to the Burgos Federation, engaged in piracy against the all-important slave ships of Mali, which was unable to defend their primitive barks against the best vessels civilization could muster. As such, Mali declared a jihad against Occitania, though this would not achieve much. In 1522, one of Vannonia's explorers encountered a young woman at a native festival. She expressed her desire to see the world, and so it was the decision of Asgail Albe to make an explorer out of her and bring her along for the journey. This was how Makatotosimiu was baptized and gave the secrets of her land to Vannonia. In the east, the great realm of Mongolia was in the heat of a civil war. Beginning in 1529, Khan Inalchi I Temujin made powerful enemies amongst his nobility, trying and failing to mimic the patriarch of his lineage, Genghis. He did this in many ways, though one of them was attempting to revive the Tengri faith, still practiced in the East, wishing to reassert it over orthodoxy. His men exploded in rebellion over this insult, and after a great and terrible war that would come to shatter the Khanate, he was killed, and his nephew Batan III Temujin would be installed as Khan over the archipelago of holdings he still had left after the war, most of the Mongol territory going to the breakaway realm of the Bulgars. In 1538, Emperor Alistair XI's youngest daughter passed from a strange fever, leaving her brother to be the new heir. Meanwhile, in another triumph of the Vannonian spirit, Captain Larry Besson of the ship called Guthlack's Compass became the first man to circumnavigate the globe in 1541, bringing glory to his country and knowledge to the world. He did it in an astounding 99 days, beginning from the crown-administered city of Porto Gorham in Vannin, Brazil, named so for the complexion of the natives. Porto Gorham was the capital of the colony and its most major port, serving to export the valuable goods produced by the Grand Atlantic Charter around the world, famed for its bountiful yields of sugar, coffee, cotton, corn, beans, rice, and wheat, as well as minor yields of exotic animal pelts. Wider Vannin, Brazil, meanwhile, was, by the middle of the 16th century, a single colony that had sprouted from the Cape Verde and Rio Grande settlements, with Alistair Marth as the colonial governor under the service of the Grand Atlantic Charter and the High Lords of Vannin. In short, it made perfect sense for Captain Larry Besson to set sail for such an expedition from there instead of some more northerly climb like the coast of Rank or some such. Thus, the journey headed south along the coast of Vannin, Brazil, then headed straight across the Atlantic past the island of St. Helena, following southern Africa to round the Cape of Good Hope, where he won the honor of being the first man to do so. Once Guthlack's compass cleared that obstacle, it sailed due north, clinging to Africa's eastern coast, sailing at one point between Madagascar and the continent itself, where natives of the Sofala tribe saw the ship and shouted at it, thronging at the beaches in their naked masses. He kept north until he hit the Horn of Africa, then hit a squall in the Indian Ocean, causing the ship to chop haphazardly through those uncharted waters. When they encountered the North Sentinel Islands, nominally under the control of the Muslim Sultanate of the Maldives, the men thought to stop and resupply, but when they got close, they didn't see the robed traders they were expecting, and were instead fired upon by natives much of the sort they saw in Africa. It would seem that the Maldives didn't control the island, but simply claimed to control it, so nobody else would try to claim it. In response to this hail of poison arrows, Captain Besson ordered that they fire their broadsides at the beaches, which caused them to flee, though not before they struck him in the shoulder. Guthlack's compass then continued on their journey, woefully undersupplied. 19 of the 50 men aboard the ship died of their wounds, and Captain Besson was barely clinging to life as the poison of the islanders coursed through his veins. He writhed for weeks, in a barely conscious delirium until they found the Philippines, whereupon the men of the ship landed and encountered a group of Chinese traders from the Kingdom of Wu, who offered their eastern medicines to the captain. After 3 more days, however, he died. And after resupply, the men buried him on the northernmost island, marked it with a heavy stone cross, and went on their way. The rest of the journey across the wide Atlantic Ocean was quiet and lonely, discovering bountiful islands laden with fruit, flowers, and dark volcanic soil until they hit the west coast of America, which they followed due south, rounding Cape Horn, where they lost 6 more men to yet another storm. The ship then managed to hobble back to Vannin, Brazil, landing in Porto Gorham with the many notes of their journey and detailed evidences of the routes they took, even holding on to some of the poison arrows, exotic fruits, and Chinese medicines they gathered along the way. The fruit was dried and preserved in salt so it wouldn't spoil, and interestingly, this gave rise to a new breakfast dish in Porto Gorham called Brishy Besson, wherein fruit is dried and then salted, and served over a porridge of rice and sweetened milk. Truly, Vannonia was undisputed colonial master of the New World, and the Pope even supported this claim, seeing great opportunity in such a rising Catholic star. Indeed, Europe itself was more preoccupied with developing and improving gunpowder weaponry, and of course fighting amongst themselves, to invest in risky, expensive colonial ventures. In 1542, being informed that the city of Porto Gorham was becoming rather wealthy, Emperor Alistair XI imposed the fish tax upon Vannin, Brazil, making them fish through approved crown docks as well, which they also had to pay certain fees to use. This made the people livid, and many of them left the city to work on behalf of the Grand Atlantic Charter. It was actually around this time that the Grand Atlantic Charter began producing its own private ships, some being employed on the business of international trade and exploration, while other unmarked vessels were employed to wander the Atlantic Ocean, harassing any other vessels that may attempt a voyage to the New World and thus become competitors to the Grand Atlantic Charter. Such a program was not terribly significant as of yet, since nobody else was trying to make the voyage, but as it grew and was fed by the deep coffers of the High Lords, it was likely that it could have truly historic ramifications. Then, after a long and incompetent rule, Emperor Alistair XI died on the 20th of January 1545, leaving his exceedingly young son, Alistair XII Monad, on the throne. This led to the establishment of a regency council and a general stability drop in the empire as a whole. As the crown passed from a fool to a child, the High Lords continued to amass incomprehensible amounts of wealth, while the crown faction made plans to wield the authority of the emperor like a cudgel. That opportunity came on the 29th of March 1546, when Pope Rufus VI decreed the Deus Sublime, a papal bull which forbid slavery in all its forms. This was a decidedly abrupt change in policy that would be quietly disregarded by most, but the Regency Council of Vannonia ended the practice immediately, knowing that it would strike a grievous blow to the High Lords and their robe faction. This also caused friction between the crown and the colonists themselves, who depended upon slavery to work their plantations, essentially the source of all their wealth. As a function of the Occident line, the High Lords were able to argue that slavery fell under their jurisdiction west of the line and outside of the cities, which was begrudgingly accepted by the crown since the only other solution was a civil war, thus allowing slavery to continue in the New World. Later that year, under the pretense of making up for the loss of slave labor in the Old World, the Regency Council imposed the sugar tax upon Vannin, Brazil, which more directly affected the pockets of the High Lords. In July, the regency ended as Empress Euphrosyne Monad rose to the throne after the premature death of her infant brother, Alistair XII, already bearing an heir in the form of her 3-year-old son, Crimton. This made for wicked portents in the eyes of the High Lords, as she was a woman with all of her faculties intact, inculcated by the collective parentage of the Crown faction. At worst, she was a decadent socialite, but not absent enough to suffer any new abuses at the hands of the High Lords and their robe faction. The first sparks began to fly when, in 1550, a dispute between nobility and the clergy broke out regarding whether the High Lords could decide when and where to construct new churches, leading to a great tension. The Empress sided with the clergy, thus leading to 22 Sixer regiments rising up in Ayrshire. The High Lords sent these lesser nobility to do this work in order to prod at the crown and test its readiness for war, as they continued to bide their time, seeking ways to counter the fetters which were slowly being placed upon them. Truly, something wicked was brewing. The High Lords of Vannin were plotting an overthrow of the monarchy, and everything that had befallen the realm until this point was part of a carefully organized plan, including the seemingly ill-prompted Sixer revolt. However, with a real presence upon the throne, and surviving members of the royal blood, one of the three would have to act, and the one that blinked first would be irrevocably consigned to ruin.